Culture that's essential to the makeup of Texas. Latinos make up the largest minority group in the state that's growing. Millions of people with their own stories and identities. They face more barriers to success than their white peers. Tonight, a deep dive into how we can all help remove those barriers to make our communities better. This is a KVUE News special production. Racial equality, building a better Austin. Thank you for joining us for night 2 of our KVUE News special presentation, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin. I'm Yvonne Nava. In these reports, we're focusing on the barriers that stand between Latino and Hispanic communities and success in Central Texas. And tonight we're joining you from Plaza Saltillo. In the heart of a historically Latino neighborhood, this part of East Austin is developing fast. Affordability issues affect almost everyone living in Central Texas. But housing inequities are amplified for Hispanics and Latinos who live in a boomtown like Austin. Here's KVUE's Diranisha Heron.
I was born and raised in 78702.
A zip code in East Austin where Black and Latino history and culture runs deep.
Our houses were actually made by my family. I remember running around through the framework with flashlights when I was 7 or 8 years old.
Cynthia Vasquez said her family owned 5 homes in East Austin. The hard work that went into building them was worth it, thanks to the community it created on Robert Martinez Street.
I could walk to my neighbor's house to borrow anything that I needed. I could play with my friends and my classmates 2 houses down. But most importantly, I had family on the same block that I lived on.
But as time went on, Vasquez said, one by one, her family members found themselves forced out, unable to afford the increasing property taxes. One by one, selling their homes, including the one she lived in with her mother.
All of our support networks, our entire lives have been in that maybe 5-block radius. So we were forced to move into the extra bedrooms that my aunt had.
While Vasquez eventually found somewhere else in the city to live, that isn't always the case.
So from 2016 to 18, the district lost close to 2,000 Latino households.
As UT law professor Heather Way and I walked in the Holly neighborhood in East Austin, you can see where old homes once stood and are now redeveloped into higher-end homes or complexes.
Central East Austin has seen this just dramatic changes in housing and who's living here. You've seen many households move in of a higher income that are buying existing affordable single-family homes and tearing them down and building million-dollar homes right here in Central East Austin.
The quick walking and biking distance from downtown Austin also made the area very vulnerable to gentrification. According to Zillow, the typical value of a home in the 78702 zip code, which is most of East Austin, has increased by almost 10% this year at about $490,000, and they predict it will go up another 8% next year. Income and housing inequalities Latinos face today started with discriminatory policies put into place in Austin as early as the 1900s.
Starting back as early as 1930s, for example, when public housing was first built in this city. We're standing right now in front of the Santa Rita Courts. It was the first public housing complex that was built in the United States under the 1937 Federal Housing Act, and this complex was created solely for Mexican Americans.
At the time, parts of East Austin were called the Negro District. Santa Rita Courts was one of 3 public housing complexes that were segregated by race.
In many neighborhoods throughout the city, you had restrictive covenants, deed restrictions that were filed in government records that barred a homeowner from selling their home to an African American or Latino household.
There were also a slew of other discriminatory practices against Blacks and Latinos like redlining, which made it almost impossible for people who lived in parts of East Austin to get a loan to make home improvements.
One of the policies that's the most just shocking was the city's 1957 industrial planning program where the city rezoned all of the land in this area in central East Austin to industrial, even single-family houses. It was environmental racism.
All of these policies and practices fueled decades of deterioration of minority-driven neighborhoods. Vasquez said there is one consequence she has to face every day as she drives to and from work on 5th Street, and that's anxiety.
Nobody talks about the emotional impacts of seeing a building there one day and seeing a gaping hole the next, and you used to go there every single day of your life.
It's grief. It's actually the feeling of grief. It's disorienting, it's traumatic, it causes health problems, it leads to addiction. There's all kinds of issues in our community that result from this tearing apart of the fabric that's held people together.
Which is why Vasquez and Carmen Yanes Pulido became community activists, to encourage people who have a hand in city planning, like Manny DeMayo, to find a way to stitch up the fabric of the community.
We're up against market forces, kind of with our hands tied behind our backs, trying to figure out strategies that we can implement as a city, that our state legislature has allowed us to have the power to do, which sometimes is a challenge.
DeMayo is the community development administrator for the city. She said recently they merged with the housing and planning department, creating a division to focus on displacement prevention. She said so far they're putting into place 15 displacement strategies. One of them is the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, where Latinos make up 37% of people in the program. And more recently, Project Connect, a $7.1 billion public transit plan approved by voters. While it does raise the property tax rate, it includes $300 million for anti-displacement housing strategies.
That may range from acquiring land around Project Connect lines. It may be emergency rental assistance, helping people stay in their homes around that. It may be targeted home repair. It could be a variety of different things.
DeMayo said the city continues to do extensive research and outreach to the lower income community to make sure the changes made align with their needs.
We're going to have much more government support for public housing and other forms of affordable housing. Without that, we're going to continue to see this dramatic outflux of Latino households who just can't afford to live here anymore.
We have a chance to interrupt and not repeat the same mistakes. But we're all waiting. We're all waiting for the powers that be to wake up to the power of the community.
In Austin, I'm Darrenisha Heron.
Housing and income inequity can have a big effect on health. Our Brian Mays sat down with Nadia Siddiqui from the Texas Health Institute to talk about health equity in Texas.
Nadia Siddiqui, thank you so much for your time today as we dig into some new findings from the HOPE initiative. Thanks for being with us. Let's start with this. The study found that less than a third of Hispanic adults in Texas say they have a high health status. What obstacles stand between Hispanics and health equity here in Texas?
Health equity means that everyone has a fair and just opportunity to lead their healthiest possible life. And the key term here is opportunity. Hispanics in Texas are half as likely to live in low poverty, thriving neighborhoods compared to white Texans. Hispanics have lower rates of achieving post-secondary education, lower rates of having livable, sustainable incomes that can truly sustain a healthy living.
Your study also found that Hispanics in Texas are less likely to have insurance coverage. What are some ways to fix that specifically?
The HOPE initiative found that non-elderly Hispanic adults have the lowest rate of health insurance coverage in Texas. With the rising numbers of uninsured amid the pandemic, we know that 2.2 million more Texans are eligible for Medicaid should it be expanded. And 60% of those are Hispanic Latinos. And so a huge opportunity to really close some of our health insurance coverage gaps by simply expanding Medicaid that would allow us to draw down billions of dollars from the federal government.
Let's talk about food security. That was a big part of the study as well. Another 1.5 million Hispanics in Texas still need better access to food. What are some ways to address this very important issue?
We have a large number of communities that are food deserts and food swamps within our state, and reversing and really investing in communities so that liquor stores and fast food restaurants in our communities and neighborhoods are not outnumbering healthy food options and healthy food stores.
Ahead, the 2020 election may be over, but both Democrats and Republicans learned a lot about the true value of Latino voters. You're watching a KVUE News special presentation, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin, sponsored by the Covert Auto Group, a family tradition since 1909. You're watching a KVUE News special presentation, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin. Welcome back. We're joining you from the Gus Garcia Recreation Center in North Austin. This center is named for Austin's first and only Hispanic mayor, Gustavo Garcia, who served from 2001 to 2003. And this location was a voting center in the 2020 election. Latinos make up the largest non-white voting bloc in the country, with 32 million eligible to vote nationwide. And census estimates show the Hispanic population could surpass the white population and become the largest population group in Texas by the middle of next year. But campaigns can't take a one-size-fits-all approach to cater to so many voters. Here's KVUE's Luis de Leon.
Pundits and political experts will talk a lot about the Latino vote and its importance in Texas. But to understand that, it's first important to understand the numbers.
In the U.S., these are the top 5 states for Latino eligible voters. You see Texas? It ranks second overall with more than 5 million Latino eligible voters. Now, when we look at the actual number of eligible Hispanic voters who showed up to the polls in the last few elections, you can see it's on the rise.
The future of winning power in Texas is going to hinge on winning the Hispanic, the Mexican origin vote.
But the Latino vote varies from state to state, and some say their past or where they came from could shape who they vote for.
That plays a crucial role. So, for example, Cubans are traditionally more conservative, more likely to vote Republican. Mexicans are more liberal, more likely to vote Democrat. Same is true of Puerto Ricans. Central Americans in general tend to vote more Democrat, whereas people from some South American countries like Venezuela tend to be more conservative. Some of that is part of the experience of growing up under the regimes that they grew up on.
In Texas, when it comes to immigrant-eligible voters, 52% are Hispanic, far more than other races or ethnicities. But how engaged are Latino voters in our area? Professor Ruth Wassam with UT's LBJ School of Public Affairs worked in Washington, D.C. for more than 25 years, testifying before U.S. Congress on things like asylum policy and immigration. She recently conducted a study which, in part, looked at civic participation in Texas's 4 biggest cities: Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and Austin.
Austin scores the lowest on civic engagement. That's going to be one of the things the city of Austin needs to work on. Well, it could affect turnout. And the extent to which Latinos are engaged here in Austin.
Another potential barrier for Latino voters is access to voter registration.
It's much easier in Latin America to vote. People are oftentimes automatically registered to vote. You don't have to sign up. In some cases, as I mentioned, voting is compulsory in Latin America. There are barriers to registration. You need to fill out the form, for example. If you change address, you need to fill out another form, etc. So it's not an automatic, easy process, and that has gotten in the way of the Latino vote. And of course, some Latinos who live in Austin are not eligible to vote, and so that's also a factor.
And Wassam says not being a naturalized citizen makes a difference.
So I would say the trend in Austin, I have every reason to think that that trajectory of increased civic engagement is already happening. Not that more can't be done to increase civic engagement, but if people are not citizens, if they have not naturalized and registered to vote, obviously that makes a difference.
The City of Austin has some resources on their website to help out with civic engagement, and when you go to register to vote, it's hard to miss the signs that include Spanish, inviting all to vote Texas. In Austin, I'm Luis De Leon.
We also caught up with Antonio Ariano, the executive director of Jolt Action. That group focuses on increasing voter participation among Latinos in Texas. And Ariano spoke with us about why politicians can't simply lump all Latino voters together when it comes to campaigning.
The Latino vote is culturally, ideologically, and linguistically diverse, and it's important that we recognize the diversities within this constituency. What we saw in this election is the growing power of the Latino electorate. 500,000 first-time Latino voters came out and voted during early voting this election cycle, and you're going to see that trend continue to tick up as the population in the state continues to change. This election cycle proved one thing, and that's that we can no longer say that, quote-unquote, Latinos don't vote. That's simply factually incorrect. Latinos are voting in Texas, and they're voting in record numbers. We got to recognize that Texas is massive, right? It's the size of 3 Georgias. So the Latino voter in Dallas is very different from the Latino voter in the Rio Grande Valley. We need to stop looking at the Latino vote as an entity and start treating it as a constituency that demands recruitment. We can't afford for Latino voters to be an afterthought. We need to be prioritized from the very beginning, and just like any other constituency, start visiting the areas and the communities that make Texas so much richer.
Still to come, a fight for equality from day one.
But the system doesn't work for a lot of other students.
Schools striving to provide the same opportunities for every child. You're watching a KVUE News special presentation, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin. watching a KVUE News special presentation, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin. Welcome back. We're joining you now from the Juan Navarro Early College High School in North Austin. Austin ISD renamed the school last year to honor Juan Navarro, a former student and U.S. Army soldier who was killed in action in Afghanistan in 2012. Hispanics and Latinos make up more than half of all students in Austin ISD schools. But equal access to education is something districts across Texas have struggled with.
If you look at education outcomes in general, and specifically at equity in education, it is the civil rights issue of our day. It is the opportunity for students to have a chance to succeed in life, but only if we as a community are willing to change systems to allow all students to access that opportunity.
And even if all kids get the same access to education, punishments in schools are a big problem for students of color.
That's an example of a policy, a clear policy that disrupts something that's harmful to children.
AISD students of color are suspended more often than their white counterparts. Our partners at the Austin American-Statesman found in the 2018-2019 school year, 7.4% of the district's black students were suspended, compared to 3.6% of Hispanic students and 1.5% of white students. AISD has stopped suspending pre-K through third grade kids, and district leaders are also working on an equity action plan to figure out how to serve all children equally. You're watching a KVUE News special presentation, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin. You're watching a KVUE News special presentation, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin. Finally tonight, KVUE reporter and anchor Patrick Perez wanted to share a personal note about his struggles with his own Latino identity and his message for young Latinos.
Hey there, I'm Patrick Perez. For those of you who don't know much about my background, let me give you a quick run-through. I was born in Caracas, Venezuela, to a Mexican father and the American daughter of Cuban refugees. I lived there for about 6 years before moving to Miami, Florida, where my mom and my brother were born. My mom wanted me to have better opportunities. And growing up, all I wanted to do was fit in, to be like the people I saw on TV and in the movies. I wanted to Americanize myself as much as I could.
Hey guys, this is Patrick, and this is my welcome to my profile.
I remember I would sometimes refuse to speak Spanish despite it being my first language. Now, fast forward all of these years later, as an adult, I do carry a sense of guilt. Guilt for not embracing my Latino heritage as a kid, guilt for not learning more about the wonderful cultures that make up my family. All of this to say to the younger Latinos and Latinas out there, don't ever feel bad about maybe looking different or being different than the kids in your class or maybe the kids that you see on TV or in the movies. Instead, appreciate every single part of you that's different and unique, because at the end of the day, that's what makes you special, and you don't want to regret not doing that later in life. Also, one more thing, and this is something that my mom told me as a little kid and even now as an adult: practica tu español.
We want to thank you all for joining us for these past 2 nights to talk about racial equality and how we can build a better Austin, specifically for Latinos. These conversations are hard to have, but they're not new and they're not going away. So if you want to watch any of our reports again, we'll post them all on our website, KVUE.com, and we'll see you back here tonight at 10 o'clock for our regularly scheduled newscast. Have a great night.